Chapter 29 Year 889 PXF Late Autumn. Osmond awoke well over an hour before dawn. He saw Thorn's empty cot and looked to Balanon, who confirmed what Osmond already knew. Thorn had left the sanctuary early to fulfill his part of the plan. Osmond knew the unmended rift between him and Thorn potentially doomed them to failure, but he hoped the gambit that had so estranged them would be worth it, and that he could at least save Thorn and Quentin, if not himself. Osmond ate the apple and soul-channeled his first form of the plan, eliciting a gasp from Balanon as he passed through the door into the streets of Arnador. As she awaited her prey, Serena peered through the mist and darkness that had yet to disgorge Arnador Keep into the light of dawn. She had flung the main gates wide and taken her position opposite them upon the battlements overlooking the courtyard, surveying her preparations. With a rueful smile on her lips, she mused that the Osmond she faced today was not the sniveling, besotted boy she had bedded 15 years ago. That boy would have charged the keep, swords brandished heroically, to save his half-brother like a Bard's Tale hero as soon as she had thrown down the gauntlet. No doubt he was planning something equally doomed to failure, but at least this might offer her a little fun. Who knows, if Osmond impressed her enough, she might chain him to a wall somewhere for her personal pleasure when all this was over with. It still vexed Serena that her eye could not penetrate whatever magics he was using to shroud his movements. Even in such close proximity, unprotected by the wards of the Uldani Isles, she had only been able to intuit his eavesdropping on her search for him, and not truly detect him. Since then, so impenetrable was his cloak that if not for the two fools from the orchard delivering his message, she would be completely unaware of his whereabouts. The timing he had requested was interesting. Darkness was Serena's domain, and the fog an ally. To meet here at dawn would mean he would have to traverse the city's streets in the pre-dawn darkness, where the creatures she had abandoned 3 years ago now ruled. Serena smirked. Even years later, her feral creations cowed to her will and the command not to kill him outright. She needed Osmond inside the gates. While the full density of the fog blanketing Arnador had not penetrated the keep's courtyard, enough piled along the walls, corners, and still places between the ruined outbuildings to serve her purpose. Her plan hinged on one single variable she couldn't control, but was sure of nonetheless: Osmond's altruism. Her patron's power, knowledge of the Vermilion Blade, and planning were unyielding facts in her favor, immune to anything Osmond did. He only needed to bring the blade into the courtyard, and she could claim the only thing in existence able to exact the full vengeance she had planned for Tommen Cor Vermain. Serena looked over her shoulder to where she had bound Quentin to a post leaning precariously over the battlements. Below him were a dozen sharpened stakes. She could release his bonds with but a thought, letting him plummet to excruciating death by impalement. Quentin recoiled at her glance as though he could see through the glamour making her appear as she did when Osmond loved her. She bared her teeth and whispered, "Play your part, fool, and you will be rewarded. Disappoint me, and what happened to your friend will seem like a blessing." With a portion of the precious higher magic her patron miserly rationed to her, Serena had empowered the illusion, making the cretin called Lander appear to be Quentin. She hated to use her precious spells this way, but Osmond had to be utterly convinced that this was Quentin, and that his half-brother was not still secured in a cell below the keep. As an extra measure, she had retrieved the silver tongue ring from Jenkins and placed it on Lander's finger in case he had to speak. Everything was in position. The final piece would soon fall into place, and then retribution would be hers. Serena could hear the sounds of her creatures harrying Osmond outside the gates. A smug smile curled her lips at the thought of Osmond stumbling out of the fog, bloodied and exhausted before her, whimpering like a kicked pup. Serena peered intently through the threshold of the keep, searching the miasma beyond. Slowly approaching, just entering the range of her innate arcane sight, she beheld the blinding magical signature of the Vermilion Blade. It arced through the thick gray mist, dispatching her minions with practiced, swift efficiency. The fog still obscured Osmond to both her naked and arcane eye, but the blade burned like a beacon. Serena couldn't help but lock her gaze upon the weapon she had coveted and needed so desperately, getting closer step by step. She could feel the Courvermain blood that had varnished its heartwood shaft for centuries calling out to her. "Just a little further, lover. Bring it to me," kept repeating in her head. Serena was poised to strike with 15 years of hate and loathing as the shadowy figure wielding the Vermilion Blade stepped out of the fog, and just as quickly, all her plans shattered around her. "Impossible!" Serena shrieked as something ruptured disconcertingly deep behind her eye in the depths of her mind. "You want the Vermilion Blade? Come and take it from its true master!" Boomed out the voice of Talon Courvermain as his imposing form stepped into the courtyard, clad in his full knight captain's plate armor, with the gleaming Vermilion Blade held at the ready. There was neither an illusion nor transmutative magic upon the figure that strode confidently to the courtyard center. Serena knew her eye could inherently detect even the most powerful of arcane subterfuge. Talon Courvermain stood before her in the flesh. "You're dead! We felt you die!" she screamed at her cousin. "Not dead, only free from the chains of our family." Talon paced confidently forward. "I never considered you a bigger fool than your brother, Serena. Yet here we are. Release Quentin," commanded Talon, pointing the Vermilion Blade at her chest. Serena's mind scrambled to piece some semblance of a plan back together. Talon had won the blade in accordance with the ancient rites twice now. It was not as simple as ripping it away from someone not of Courvermain blood with her patron's pact as she had planned. However, as evidenced by his wielding it against her, Talon had again bent the weapon against its nature and will. Serena had broken the blade free of his influence once before. She could do it again. "Kill him!" she screeched. Half a dozen of her more recent and deadliest creatures prowled out of the pockets of fog around the courtyard as the keep's gates slammed shut behind Talon. "You will not only die yourself, cousin. You've killed your precious Osmond's brother as well." With a dramatic look and malicious smile, Serena released Quentin's bonds with a wave of her hand. His body fell with a sickening wet thunk onto the sharpened stakes below. "No!" Talon screamed. Assured that Talon had seen the result of her actions, Serena touched a smoky gray gem on her wrist, flooding the courtyard with a bank of magical fog further bolstered by the environment around them. Serena knew she had to break Talon's will, or at least weaken his concentration enough for the pact with her patron to rip the Vermilion Blade from his grasp. The boy's death would start that process, and her creations could hopefully overwhelm him sufficiently for her to strip the weapon from his control. She watched the brilliant crimson glow of the Vermilion Blade dance through the fog, all else obscured to the naked eye. As much as she wanted to see the full extent of the battle below, she needed to save her remaining magics for wresting the blade from Talon when the chance presented itself. Serena blindly shot bolts of energy into the fog at her best estimation of Talon's location based on the dancing Vermilion Blade, but to no avail. Then she saw her opening, a slight stutter in the swinging arcs of the blade. Something had thrown Talon off balance. She reached out for her family's blood, for her birthright, for what she was due after all of her suffering under Toman's hand. She channeled the power of her higher magic into her call, beckoning the Vermilion Blade to come to her hand. She flooded the summons with her magical reserves, opening herself to her connection to her family's blood within the blade. Serena ignored another disturbing pop behind her eye, this time accompanied by a sickening movement of internal structures where she knew no movement should be felt, and redoubled her efforts to bend her family's bond with the Vermilion Blade to her will. The Vermilion Blade shuddered momentarily, then flew like an arrow loosed from a bow to her hand. Serena snatched the glaive out of the air with a cry of triumph as the weapon welded itself firmly in her grasp. As Thorn crept through the damp, narrow passage under Arnador Keep, his mind kept returning to a single place. Somewhere above him, Talon Coeur-Vermain was walking the earth once more. The flesh that was the culmination of Toman's heinous design, whose creation had begun with the death of Riken. A body that his father had groomed into a perverted version of the man Thorn was meant to be by gorging it on the life force of his beloved and Osmund's father. And now his soul brother was wearing the corpse of the life Thorn had left behind. The plan would work. Serena would never see it coming, and the subterfuge would be undetectable because the form Osmund wore was Talon's flesh for all intents and purposes. But emotionally, Thorn couldn't overcome how violated he felt. Even if they did succeed and he finally was reunited with Riken, how would he ever look at Osmund the same way again? Had he regained his true love only to lose his brother in the process? Thorn came to the hidden door that gave access to the dungeons. He put his eye to the peephole, but only saw darkness beyond. He closed his hooded lantern to the narrowest of slits and pulled the lever to release the hidden panel that concealed the passageway he had traversed. Thorn slid back the panel. The acrid smell of chemicals, decay, urine, and feces assaulted his nose, making his eyes water. Thorn slipped out of the passage and into what should have been the guard's common area, but was now fitted out for a different function. The room looked like a mix between an alchemy lab, a surgery, and one of Naz's arcane workrooms. Thorn was thankful the dim light of his lantern did not illuminate more of the horrors that filled the myriad of containers or the blood and viscera-soaked tables menacingly fitted with manacles. Looking down the hallway of cells he sought, Thorn could see the eyeshine of the juvenile creatures within staring back at him. He couldn't decide what was more unnerving, the sheer number of eyes, or that none of the twisted animals behind their barred confines made even the slightest sound at his intrusion. Thorn crept forward and down the hallway of cells, the pitiful, distorted creatures behind the bars cowering as he passed, some daring to let out only the tiniest of hopeless whimpers as his light moved by them. Thorn hoped his hunch was correct that Serena would put Quentin in the fully enclosed cell at the end of the hallway, barred by a heavy wooden door. As he crept closer, the sliver of light from his lantern caught the eyeshine of a pair of eyes at the end of the hallway, nearly at the level of his own.
"Well, if it isn't my old friend, the Edgeborn Orchard twat,"
Jenkins said in a slurred voice. Thorn could hear the sticky sound of wet flesh being pulled apart as the eyes in front of him began to rise, higher and higher over his head. Far higher than Jenkins was tall. With the sound of bone against metal, something swiped the lantern out of Thorn's hand. It slammed into the floor with a clang, extinguishing the only open flame in sight, and leaving him in total darkness. Osmund, channeling Talon's flesh, braced himself and stood ready in the courtyard as the fog engulfed him, his cry of "No!" still echoing off the courtyard walls. Osmund kept reassuring himself. It wasn't Quentin. It wasn't Quentin. Osmund had barely had time to look at the man who fell onto the spikes. In a strange twist of irony, he had to trust Serena that the person she killed even looked like Quentin, as he had only seen him as an infant. Gwen had to be right. She had to be. Serena wouldn't throw away her best bargaining chip so quickly. Osmund just had to execute the plan. The gray wall of fog that engulfed Osmund must be from something Serena had cast, because it wasn't his. Just to be sure, he unleashed the similar spell they had stored in the replica of the Vermilion Blade before activating the Curse rune. Tracing out the combination of patterns etched in the shaft, the curse and accompanying enchantment came to life. As planned, the weapon began to animate of its own accord. Osmond leaped into action before any hidden predators Serena summoned could close around him. Leaving the blade to do its work, Osmond shimmered into the form of the trickster, willing his destination into her instincts. Thorn! Osmond braced his innards against the onslaught of the world folding around him, but nothing happened. Osmond tried another destination, the dungeons. Still nothing. Serena's creatures were almost upon him, and Osmond couldn't risk confronting any of them in the trickster's fragile form. He blindly scrambled through the fog cloud, hoping they would attack the floating weapon that harried them instead of the live prey that was zigzagging its way to cover. Crackling magical explosions began to fill the courtyard around Osmond as his borrowed instincts guided him. He dove under collapsed wagons and weaved through the ruins of the courtyard outbuildings. Snarling shadows leapt over him, and jaws snapped at his bushy tail as the animated weapon slashed and parried at its attackers from above. Osmond's mind, still racing, tried to understand why the trickster's ability couldn't reach Thorn inside the keep. Perhaps Serena had magic strong enough to thwart them, or, more likely, there were no open flames in the lower levels. If that was the case, what had happened to Thorn and his lantern? Something had gone wrong. Behind him, Osmond heard the clack of tooth on metal as one of the creature's jaws clamped down on the Vermilion Blade. His fur bristled and stood on end as arcane possibility built up throughout the fog around him like lightning about to strike. He heard the whoosh of the blade flying overhead and across the courtyard. A cry of triumph punctuated the resounding clap of the haft of the Vermilion Blade hitting Serena's hand. Osmond knew he had no time left. He had to find Thorn. Between one leap and the next, the trickster became the matriarch who was no stranger to hunting within blinding mists. As he flew skyward, careful to remain in the densest part of the fog, Osmond didn't need the matriarch's sensitive ears to hear Serena's call of triumph turn into a howl of fury. With a rapid succession of high-pitched screeches, his echolocation revealed the scene unfolding below. Serena was staring in rage at the weapon welded to her hand. Osmond could hear through arcane-attuned ears the curse stripping away the spells surrounding Serena and spooling what remained of her more powerful magics out of her and binding it into a knotted skein. Serena broke her concentrated stare at the cursed weapon and focused on the courtyard below. She leaped off the battlements and ran to the remains of the courtyard's old smithy in a limping sprint. Osmond knew he should flee and try to locate Thorn, but he couldn't pull himself away. He circled once on silent wings and let out another series of high-pitched calls, unable to leave without knowing Serena's fate. His senses revealed Serena as she tied a scrap of leather thong around her forearm, cinching it tight with practiced skill. Serena's form, as he knew it, was slowly dissolving as the curse continued to eat away at her magic. She picked up a rusty axe, laid the wrist of the hand welded to the false Vermilion Blade on the pitted anvil, and swung. "Flee now!" The matriarch's gravelly command in his head pulled him out of the horror of what he was watching as much as the clang of axe blade on metal did. Serena's head snapped to his location as though she also heard the matriarch. Her face was a sick grotesquerie of what it had once been. Osmond heard her voice slither around him as the false Vermilion Blade clanged to the ground, her hand still attached. "This isn't over, lover."